In 1914, a ship called the Endurance sailed south toward a continent no one had ever crossed on foot. What followed was not the triumph its crew had trained for. It was a 2-year fight simply to stay alive, a story of a ship crushed by ice, of men adrift on frozen floes, and of a leader who made a promise to bring every single one of his crew home. This is that story. Ernest Shackleton had already tried and failed to be first to the South Pole. That prize now belonged to others. So Shackleton set his sights on something no one had ever done, crossing the entire Antarctic continent on foot, coast to coast, nearly 1,800 miles across ice and mountains. He called it the Imperial Transantarctic Expedition. His ship, a reinforced 3-masted vessel built for polar ice, was named Endurance, a word taken from his own family motto, Fortitude Vincimus. By endurance, we conquer. In August 1914, as Europe slid into the First World War, Shackleton and his crew of 27 men sailed from England. Then from South Georgia Island into the Weddell Sea, Captain Frank Worsley, an expert navigator, guided the ship through increasingly dense pack ice. The ice was closing faster than the charts allowed for. Worsley pushed on while there was still open water. Shackleton agreed. The ship, he said, wasn't built to sit still. But the Weddell Sea in 1915 was colder and more hostile than anyone anticipated. By January, the Endurance was no longer sailing. It was trapped, frozen solid into a moving mass of pack ice, drifting wherever the ice itself chose to drift. For 10 months, the ship and her crew were prisoners of the Antarctic winter. Through the long polar winter, the crew settled into a strange, suspended existence. They kept to routines, meals, watches, exercise for the sled dogs on the ice. Anything to hold off the isolation and the dark. Shackleton, aware that morale could collapse as easily as the ship's hull, insisted on structure and, whenever possible, on levity. When the men asked when they'd break free, he told them the truth. The ice didn't care what they asked. They would wait, they would work, and they would stay ready to move the moment it let them. But the ice was not simply holding the Endurance, it was slowly crushing it. By October 1915, the pressure of shifting ice floes began to buckle the ship's timbers. The sound, crew members later wrote, was like artillery fire, the groan of a wooden hull being squeezed by forces no ship could withstand. On October 27, 1915, Shackleton gave the order every man on board had been dreading. Abandon ship, he told them. Take only what you can carry, and take care of each other. The Endurance was crushed and finally sank on November 21, 1915. Shackleton watched it disappear beneath the ice from a distance and wrote simply in his diary that night, the ship was gone. 28 men now stood on a floating sheet of ice in the most remote and hostile environment on Earth, with no ship, no radio, and no way for anyone in the outside world to know where they were. What followed was not a rescue story. It was survival, month after month, on a drifting island of ice that could crack open beneath their tents at any moment. The men set up what they called ocean camp, salvaging what supplies and lifeboats they could from the wreck before it sank. There was food enough for a time, but the sled dogs would need to go before winter deepened. There simply wasn't enough to keep them and the men both fed. It was, by every account, one of the most painful decisions of the journey. The dogs, many of them named and loved by individual crew members, could not be sustained. Shackleton made the call himself, refusing to let the burden fall on any one man. For months, the ice floe carried them slowly northward, drifting with ocean currents completely outside their control. They shifted camps twice more as the ice beneath them cracked and shrank. Rations dwindled to penguin and seal meat when they could get it, and little else when they could not. Worsley kept meticulous navigational records, tracking their drift by sextant even with no fixed point of reference beneath their feet. At their current rate, he calculated, they would reach open water near Elephant Island within the month, if the floe held that long. Shackleton's answer was simple. It would hold long enough, and every man would keep his strength up. That was an order, not a suggestion. In April 1916, after nearly a year and a half without solid ground beneath them, the ice floe finally began to break apart under the crew's feet. Shackleton gave the order to launch the 3 small lifeboats they had salvaged from the Endurance, and the crew set out across some of the most dangerous open water on the planet. For 7 days, the men rowed and sailed through freezing swells, soaked constantly by icy spray, taking turns at the oars in shifts that left every man exhausted, frostbitten, and half-frozen. On April 15, 1916, they finally reached solid ground, the desolate, storm-battered shore of Elephant Island. It was the first solid earth any of them had stood on in 497 days. Actual land, Frank Wild said, staring at the rock beneath his feet. And not a soul on earth knew they were standing on it. Elephant Island was uninhabited, far from any shipping route, and offered no real hope of rescue. Shackleton understood immediately that landing there had not solved their problem, it had only bought them time. If they were ever going to be found, someone would have to go and find help. Shackleton made a decision that many historians still regard as one of the boldest gambles in the history of exploration. He would take the sturdiest of the 3 lifeboats, a 22.5-foot vessel later named the James Caird, and sail it across 800 miles of the most violent ocean on Earth, to reach the whaling stations of South Georgia Island, the nearest place any hope of rescue existed. He selected 5 men to join him, including Worsley for his navigation, and Tom Crean, whose endurance had already been tested on to prior Antarctic expeditions. Shackleton told Crean plainly that he needed men he trusted with his life on this crossing. Crean didn't hesitate. He wouldn't have needed to be asked twice. Frank Wild was left in command of the 22 men remaining on Elephant Island, with instructions that, if Shackleton did not return within a reasonable time, Wild should attempt to lead the men to safety by whatever means he could. "If I'm not back," Shackleton told him, "do whatever needs doing. Don't wait on hope alone. Get the men out." Wild's answer was simple. They would be there when he came back, all of them. On April 24, 1916, the James Caird launched into the Southern Ocean. 6 men aboard a boat built for coastal work, now facing some of the largest waves and fiercest storms on the planet. The journey to South Georgia took 17 days. The men aboard the James Caird faced hurricane-force winds, waves that Worsley estimated at over 30 feet, and a nearly constant coating of freezing sea spray that had to be chipped away from the boat's frozen deck to keep it from capsizing under the extra weight. Worsley navigated by dead reckoning alone, aware that being off by even a few degrees in that weather could mean missing the island entirely. Shackleton's answer left no room for doubt. Worsley had never let the crew down yet, and he wouldn't start now. Worsley's navigation performed with a sextant on a violently pitching boat, using only brief glimpses of the sun through storm clouds. would later be studied by generations of sailors as one of the most remarkable feats of seamanship on record. On May 10, 1916, 17 days after launching from Elephant Island, the exhausted crew of the James Caird sighted South Georgia. But their ordeal was not yet finished. Storms forced them to land on the uninhabited southern coast of the island, opposite the whaling station where help waited. Between them and rescue stood miles of uncharted, glacier-covered mountains that no one had ever crossed. 2 of the 6 men were too weakened by the crossing to continue. Shackleton chose Worsley and Crean to join him on a final push. A 36-hour trek across mountains, glaciers, and ridgelines, with no map, no tent, and no proper climbing equipment, surviving on a few scraps of rationed food. Crean warned that if they stopped moving for long, they wouldn't start again. Cold like that put a man to sleep for good. Shackleton's answer was final. They would not stop, not for anything, until they saw that station. The 3 men climbed through the night, at one point sliding down the far side of a mountain ridge on a coiled rope simply because it was faster and safer than trying to climb down in the dark. Exhausted beyond anything they had yet endured, they pressed on through a second sleepless night, driven by the knowledge that 22 men were still waiting on Elephant Island, and 3 more on the far side of South Georgia, depending entirely on them reaching help. On the morning of May 20th, 1916, after 36 hours without rest, the 3 men stumbled down toward the Stromness whaling station. The first person to see them, a young boy near the station, reportedly fled in fear at the sight of them. 3 filthy, bearded, half-starved figures who looked barely human after nearly 2 years in the Antarctic. Shackleton asked to be taken to the station manager, a man who had met him years earlier and did not, at first, recognize him. "You don't know me, I think," Shackleton said quietly, "but my name is Shackleton." The station manager, by several accounts, wept. With help finally reached, a boat was sent immediately around the island to retrieve the 3 men left on the southern coast. But 22 men were still stranded on Elephant Island, and Shackleton would not rest until every one of them was accounted for. It took for attempts over more than 3 months, battling pack ice that turned back ship after ship, before Shackleton finally secured a vessel capable of reaching Elephant Island. On August 30th, 1916, the Yelcho, a small steam tug loaned by the Chilean government, broke through the ice near the island. Frank Wild, who had led the 22 remaining men for over 4 months on a barren, wind-battered strip of rock, had kept his promise. Every single day, he had ordered the men to pack their gear each morning, insisting that today might be the day Shackleton returned. Some of the men, by their own later accounts, had begun to lose hope. Wild never let it show if he had. "Roll your gear up, lads," he called down to them. "There's the boss. Come back for us," just like he said he would. Every one of the 22 men on Elephant Island was alive, combined with the 6 from the boat journey and the crew already rescued. The final count stood at 28 men who had sailed south in 1914, and 28 men who came home. Not one life was lost. The Endurance expedition never achieved what it originally set out to do. Shackleton never crossed the Antarctic continent. In the eyes of the world he left behind in 1914, the expedition might have looked, on paper, like a failure. But history remembers it differently. What Ernest Shackleton and his crew accomplished was not a crossing of a continent, it was something rarer. For nearly 2 years, stranded in the most hostile environment on the planet, With no way to call for help and no guarantee any of them would survive, 28 men lived, worked, and endured together. And when it was over, every single one of them was still alive to tell the story. The wreck of the Endurance itself was lost for over a century, sitting nearly 2 miles beneath the Weddell Sea, until researchers finally located and filmed it in 2022, remarkably preserved by the cold, dark waters, still bearing her name across the stern more than 100 years after she sank. Make sure to subscribe, because the ocean is full of mysteries just like this one, still waiting to be told.